Thank you very much for inviting us, Jean-Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's perfect for us to present this speech together because, in fact, the experiment that we run in the United States at Carnegie Mellon is an experiment in which we have humanities students and engineering students taught by us together simultaneously. So you get to have the same experience that our students have. And so Jennifer is in the Dietrich College, which is the humanities college at Carnegie Mellon. I'm in the School of Computer Science, which is a technical side where the Robotics Institute is housed. And so you will be exposed to the same kind of border crossing that we are always endeavoring to expose our students to. So we want to talk about this class, AI in Humanity. To prepare you for that presentation, we thought it actually would be useful to show you some videos. Jean-Paul showed you some videos that are similar to what we'll show you. And in particular, I want to show you two videos, and I want you to think about your own emotional response to these videos. Perhaps 90% of you have seen one or the other, or maybe both. But I want you to think about how you feel about the videos as you watch them. So we'll just do that first. And it's funny because this company, Boston Dynamics, actually has a new policy that they no longer kick robots. So the result of this video was that even though they don't kick robots, they do things like this. Here's one of the more recent robots that they had. And of course, here's what the gentleman does to it. So I'll let you watch that a little bit. But what's interesting about these videos, to me, in terms of the emotional response you might have to them, is that you may move from kind of a humor engagement around them to a kind of discomfort engagement about them. And there is this lingering conception of empathy that may formulate. And it's an odd kind of empathy, right? Because what you're doing is empathizing with a mechanical thing, an automata that has no soul, no explicit intentionality, no distinct notion of how autonomous it may even be. It could be extremely remote controlled for all you know as you watch the video. So the fact that the technology creates a sense of conflicted emotions in you is actually an interesting demonstration of the power technology has in this age to push on the boundaries of what we believe it means to be human, to have agency, to understand intentionality. And because technology is changing so rapidly, and because the impact that this can have is so readily felt by any audience, that takes us to this issue that, in fact, societal conflict and the ways in which societal conflict connects to meaning-making and sense-making about the world around us may actually interact quite closely with technology today because of how technology is changing and pushing back on society. So that's what takes us to the class. And we're going to start introducing you to this class by actually introducing you to an earlier class we taught, which was also about society and technological conflict. So I'll hand it over to Jen to introduce you to the predecessor to this class.
Thank you, Illah. As Illah indicated, a lot of the foundational questions that we are interested in investigating in AI and humanity really had to do with the ways that humans are interacting with machines and the developing anxieties that are circulating presently, especially in mainstream press, attending to the question of human-machine relationships. We thought the precedent of human-to-human relationships and the long history of exploitation and negotiations of power were a very good vessel for us to open up communication, especially with first semester computer science students and humanities and social science students. So in the first class that we taught, it was actually a case study on the conflict in Northern Ireland, the civil war over the course of 30 years in Northern Ireland that had multiple factors at play, a long history of legacies of imperialism, militaristic strategies associated with the British state, the negotiation of that power dynamic within the Irish state, and the legacies of the ways that technological advancement really influenced and shaped a lot of the emerging conflict in the course of the 30-year civil strife in Northern Ireland. So the first course we actually taught was called Art, Conflict, and Technology in the North of Ireland. And we had a third partner, actually, John Carson, in the School of Art at Carnegie Mellon. So we've taught this class twice now, always investigating the emergence of technological advancements that really shaped media, as well as military strategy in regards to population control, the evolution of surveillance within the context of conflict, and really attending to the ways in which that moved from the late 20th century up until the current state. One of the things that I think is really important in regards to the context of this workshop is the ways in which this particular conflict indicated language that was in continual contestation. The politicization of language, the circulation of narrative, and the ways in which those narratives were in contestation at the very heart of civil strife over multiple generations in the North. We wanted to really introduce students to inhabiting a space of empathy, really thinking about the ways in which language is an organic structure that shifts over time. And essentially, we were looking at the ways in which that shifting over time, the malleability sometimes of time, in terms of the way that artists and writers attend to that, was at stake as well. So within the current course, AI and Humanity, it's a very complex foundational idea, right? We're really trying to figure out how we might be able to build a common lexicon amongst students who are relatively uninitiated in terms of analytical framing, attending to society. In order for us to begin to develop some type of common space within the classroom, as well as attending to the multiple variables at play in looking at the relationships between technology and society, we needed to develop a common lexicon. These are students who are not linguists. These are students who are taking first-year writing courses in rhetoric, really just looking at rudimentary forms of argumentation and interpretation. They are not initiated in this process. So we already had to figure out how we would assemble a common space for us to attend to the very complex issues that are currently at play. We decided to work with Raymond Williams' keywords. I don't know if anyone has heard of this text. No? Okay, so I'm going to give a brief indication of the work that Williams was doing. So in keywords, Williams was writing the Long Revolution, so really attending to the rise of capitalism and the emergence of socialist ideology. And through the course of that work in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he started noticing the prevalent circulation and shifting of the meaning of particular keywords. Really thinking about the classic German philological focus on the evolution of language over time. And essentially, he basically just kept a log of what he saw as these mutations of the meaning of language and culture over time. He ended up pulling that collection together into its own piece, which was the keywords that was produced, I think published in the late 1960s. And one of the things that was really interesting was that at University of Pittsburgh, where I studied for my PhD, Jesus College at Cambridge University and the University of Pittsburgh decided to partner on a web-based keywords project. So they invited undergraduate students who were studying either literature and culture, or linguistics, as well as senior level researchers from throughout the world to attend to specific keywords that were in circulation in the early 2000s. So building on Williams' work, the Keywords Project has recently now turned into a new piece called Keywords for Today. And it's coming out with Oxford University Press next September. We'll be referring to it quite a bit here. But essentially, the idea behind using keywords, the Keywords Project, and Keywords for Today was to introduce our students to the organic nature of language, to really introduce them to the idea that language shifts over time. And if we are more comfortable and attuned to the ways in which language is shifting, we can understand how to develop some type of common lexicon so that we begin to control some of the variables at play in the complexity of the questions that we wanted to analyze within the class. Okay? So some of the keywords that we worked with include technology and society, labor, inequality and dignity, narrative, exploitation and labor, agency and autonomy, agency, labor, and narrative, surveillance and agency, literacy and data, data and individuality, autonomy, surveillance, and weaponry. And essentially what we have is this movement through the course of the semester in the class that allows the students to work with each of the definitions of these words in isolation and then slowly understand their relationships to one another in the context of whatever question, piece of literature, memoir, or film that we are then analyzing, basically using these keywords as the frame for our analysis, okay, so that they have tools to really engage in the analytical work that we're interested in undertaking. So through the course of our talk today, we're really going to introduce you to a couple examples of the keywords to basically model the kind of work that we've been doing with students this semester.
So we won't do this for all our keywords because that would take us a semester to do with you. But let's start with technology and society, just so you get a sense of what the students are reading and then what works we bring to bear on this. This is an entry from Keywords for Today that McCabe and company have allowed us to share with you. So even though this is unpublished work so far. Just to give you a sense of what they see. And what's interesting about what they see is they see both the antecedent of technology, the idea that technology actually comes from the arts, and it's something that a lot of the students are surprised by. And what we're trying to do is slow down their understanding of what technology is, disambiguate science fiction and imagined technology from the state of the art, what is reality. And in fact, a lot of this course ends up being something that Malak and I were joking about at lunch, which is disambiguating things like the singularity from what is actually possible, disambiguating the idea of artificial intelligence and immortality. I was going to say immorality. Immortality from the reality of the ways in which artificial intelligence may change hegemonic power structures or reinvigorate business practices or corporate practices in making humans subaltern to corporation, for instance. But in all these cases, we're trying to attend to the material reality of what's actually state of the art. And by introducing a definition for technologists and the idea of the practical arts, we slow the student down to start to understand what is technology, what is the state of the art. We literally provide them with lessons on the state of the art in robotics, the state of the art in computer vision and artificial intelligence, and try and use words that are precise and well defined. And then we combine that with this interesting tuple, right, which is society. So first you start to ask the students, what does society even mean? And this Raymond Williams keywords entry on society is interesting because they start to understand the idea of institutional and organizational structures as defining society, but also the notion of relationship and abstraction of people. And once you do this, once you kind of connect technology to society, in a way taking things that are very complementary or separate and attaching them to each other, then what's interesting is to take media that are commentaries on that coupling and make that media apparent to the students. So in this case, we did that with film by Werner Herzog, which is just perfect for this particular task. Lo and behold, Reveries of the Connected World. It's a science documentary made by Werner Herzog, where he interviews a number of people about the initial creation of the internet. He talks to people who were in the ARPANET structure originally. But then he goes and looks at the societal ramifications of the internet, including looking at communities who live away from the internet, people who explicitly force themselves to be as far away from technology as possible, and what worlds they live in and how they think about their state of existence and the relationship they have to technology and how it pushes back on them. So what happens is the students right away at the very beginning of the semester are learning about cultural critique vis-a-vis technology. So the idea of a utopian view of technology is being blemished by the notion of dystopia and the notion of critique. And so for once, they can start looking at technology not as a techno-optimist, not as somebody for whom technology solves all problems, but as technology is something where with a 360-degree view, we can imagine understanding its ramifications. And Herzog gives us direct access to that. That's sort of an example of how we start with keywords and then take media and then create journal entries written by the students reflecting on that cultural critique and then reflecting on that in comparison to the kind of cultural milieu they live in today. So I'm going to hand it back to Jen for another keyword tuple.
So as Illah indicated, we're working within the institutional paradigms associated with specific historical moments in societies. We work primarily within the context of the West for this course. There are innumerable ways in which it could go in different directions, but that's where we have decided to place ourselves just for pragmatics. In order for us to begin to really consider the implications or the features of the human-like machines, we needed the students to really engage with some type of concept for humanity, right? And this notion of humanity has been in contest, of course, for generations. But we wanted the students to really have some type of foothold in common text in order to begin to interrogate that notion of what they seem to uncritically understand as human. And if we were to just basically step into the race of attending to the machines and the features within machines that either mimic or aspire to be human-like, we have no point of comparison, right? So we really needed to figure out some type of language to describe the features of humanity. Keywords was helpful, but we really needed to place that within a deeper context historically. And one of the ways in which we were able to really think about that was within the relation of humanity and the question of labor, okay? So I'm actually gonna just read this definition because I think it's useful. Again, working with Williams. So from the early 16th century in English, the modern development is complex. The sense of courtesy and politeness is extended to kindness and generosity. Humanity is a general name to these virtues in whom seemeth to be a mutual concord and love in the nature of man. But there is also, from the late 15th century, use of humanity in distinction from divinity. This rested on the medieval substitution of a contrast between limited humanity and absolute divinity for the older classical contrast between humanity and that which was less than human, whether animal or barbaric. So we can begin to really think about the implications of this within societal institutions like the paradigm of colonialism and the paradigm of human enslavement, okay? So one of the texts that we introduced was Simon Head's Mindless, and we wanted the students to basically begin to interrogate the texts that we were sharing the films within particular contexts. So we asked the students to read Mindless with an eye towards the developing technology that informed the business practices with companies like Walmart and Amazon, which are huge within the United States, the ways in which labor was commodified within those particular companies, but also understanding the historical evolution of labor force, especially from the 19th century industrialization through the contemporary period, the implications for these systems within societies, and also the ways in which this development had shaped or compromised or basically raised some types of questions on who is considered human. So just a quick citation from Head's work in context to the Amazon warehouses. Workers would be reprimanded for speaking to one another or for pausing to catch their breath, pause, after an especially tough packing job. The functional foreman would record how often the packers went to the bathroom, and if they had not gone to the bathroom nearest the line, why not? I'm just gonna let you guys sit with that rather than interpret it for you. And then this notion of emotional labor, a form of labor really associated with different parts of the service economy. So the multifaceted deterioration in the condition of labor helps explain why the theorists and practitioners of emotional labor devote so much of the effort to the repression of negative, work-disrupting emotions before trying to replace them with more customer-friendly ones, which they think will be good for sales. But looking at this project with even a modicum of historical perspective, it seems doomed. The harsh, unforgiving workplace described by Keating yields a negative emotional labor all of its own, and the longer this workplace endures, the more entrenched become the emotional armor that employees must rely on to protect themselves against a hostile world. Thus, cynicism, resentment, emotional withdrawal, and the withholdings of loyalty from employers who show no loyalty to them. So Illah mentioned that in working with the students, we really guide their analysis through these almost weekly journal entries. We ask the students to attend to specific questions that really help to, on some level, scaffold and streamline their analysis because they're first semester undergraduates, right? So we really seed and prime the ways in which they're responding to the text early in the semester. We also decided it would be really useful for the students to do some type of conceptual mapping of many of the works they were coming in contact with. We went back and forth quite a bit on whether or not we would use argumentation diagramming in order to decipher some of the texts, or if we really were interested in the students attending instead to concepts. And at the end, we decided to focus on concepts primarily because of the other parts of the curriculum that really attend to argumentation, that the students would be better equipped to attend to argumentation in later semesters rather than first. So the concepts were really where we decided to strategically place the curriculum. This is one of our students' responses to the mindless text, very early. I think this is the third week of the semester. So here you can see the ways in which the concepts are foregrounded with specific nodes. So things like income gap, automation, efficiency, emotional labor, workers' morale and respect, labor management, surveillance. The students tease out the concepts that they think are crucial to the reading or to the film or whatever the provocation might be. And then what you see are the descriptions of the relationships. So it creates a desire for increased efficiency, leading to labor management and such. So we actually have the students do 4 of these through the course of the semester as individuals, and then we have them seated in groups, 2 computer science students, 2 humanities social science students, and they actually choose a theme for a semester end project concept map where they start to bring the different texts and films, other primary artifacts basically, in conversation with one another, attending to a specific keyword that they find to be useful to interrogate further.
And I have to mention something because it's so incredibly ironic, but it's not lost upon the students that Amazon, which wants to control every second of an employee's time, thereby roboticizing the employees and dehumanizing them, is the same company that also bought Kiva to make sure they don't have to have any employees at all by physically roboticizing the exact same work structure. So it's kind of, we keep seeing this, right? Uber does the same thing with drivers, roboticizing the driver and then replacing the roboticized driver with a robot. So this may be something we're going to see more and more in society. Now, what we haven't talked about yet is some of the historical context that we provide. And this is where we're going to flip into that. This picture is a picture of a cotton gin. And this is a picture that we took at the African American Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., the new museum there that's well worth seeing next time you're in Washington, D.C. And what's interesting here is we wanted to start to mine into the institutional features of society and historical precedents in society that let us understand what dehumanization looks like and what labor looks like in a context in which we are going to see labor relations in the future that are challenged by robotics and automation, and how that changes the dynamics of capital flow and labor income flow. So what better way to do that than to go back to slavery and think exactly and precisely about that subject? What's totally interesting about this and relates to today is that in fact the automation that you get from the American British institution of slavery and the invention of the cotton gin, which you would think would be labor saving, right? Because you're able to clean cotton through a machine. In fact, if you look at the signage at the African American Museum, points out the exact opposite, which was really, I think, a surprise. Well, it was a surprise to me, and I think it was so for the students as well. This was text right next to the cotton gin at the museum. Raw cottons packed with seeds that make the fiber impossible to weave. Eli Whitney patented a mechanical cotton gin that combed the seeds out of the soft fiber. Before Whitney's gin, one person could clean 1 pound of cotton a day. The gin increased that number by 5,000%. Remarkable. This left a major bottleneck, picking enough cotton to fill the gins. Slave owners forced enslaved African Americans to work longer and harder and demanded more land in the West. So what this does is start to release to the students the notion of systems thinking. That in fact, automation in one part of a supply chain or line of business can actually increase dehumanizing pressures on the remaining laborers, human laborers. So they start to see complexity in this model and stop thinking about this in terms of these simple quid pro quo zero-sum games where people say, well, we won't have any traffic jams as soon as cars are driverless, which doesn't attend to any of the dynamics around how many cars will be on the road that happen to be driverless, or whether people will live further away from work because they can be in a driverless car going to work, and therefore miles per consumption may actually increase. So all those dynamic systems implications disappear when you do that. This example let us introduce slavery, but also the dynamics of the ways in which automation plays with slavery. And of course, that makes it really hit close to home when you're talking about automation and robotics. And taking that to the present, that also lets us talk about the notion of labor that is not compensatory, and in particular digital labor. So digital labor becomes a concept that we introduce at this point in the class. So it's kind of neat, right? You're taking the students back to slavery, to the cotton gin, and then forward to digital labor, to the notion that when you want to buy a ticket to go to a performance of a concert series that you care about, in fact, first, you have to go and click on all the homes or storefronts on a picture. Why? Why do you have to do that? To identify that you're a human? Not exactly. Because a company is being paid to identify the storefronts for Google image search, and you are doing labor for them. And guess what? You're not getting paid for your labor. In fact, you're doing the labor and then spending your own money to buy the ticket. So we introduce them to this beautiful kind of socialization of labor where capitalism accrues the benefits, but society writ large accrues the cost. And again, this changes their systems thinking around labor and the degree to which even digitization and computer vision are actually causing humans to do labor that was unintended originally for human purchase. So that, I think, echoes this question of human labor dynamics over time and brings it to the forefront for today, which sort of snaps them to the real world. But I mentioned slavery, and we really have to deep dive into that. So, Jen.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really important that we remind the students on multiple occasions within the context of the examples we're using is we're really demonstrating echoes and evolution of the echoes of certain systems over time, not necessarily equating digital labor to enslavement of African populations within the British and American context. In relation to this notion of humanity, we thought Douglas's narrative would be an opportunity for students to really think about a moment in American history where a whole section of a human labor force was considered not citizen, not human, actually property. We really wanted the students to think about the ways in which the potency of language, literacy, and an ability to articulate political interruption to this notion of slave as property, instead asserting the idea of slave as human, was significant. In order to do that, we needed to figure out a way to really bring the students' attention to this notion of literacy. So things like IBM's Watson, right? There are ways in which the Watson platform, when advertised by IBM, is often presented as reading, right? It's not necessarily the ways in which the sales pitch is focused. It's a way to make a lot of the system intelligible to the layperson. But we also thought it was really interesting to have the students start thinking about the ways in which the slave as human was also not really something that many people wanted to entertain, especially if they were in positions of power in the 19th century in America, in the 18th century within the context of Britain. We also wanted the students to be aware of the ways in which the imperialist ideology of usurpation of land, extraction of resources, and the use of indigenous populations, oftentimes as a labor force, were really the bedrock of the imperialist enterprise. And there are ways in which we could introduce those ideas, not with a deep dive, but really attending to these as some of the historical precedents and the institutions informing the society that they were looking at in terms of the contemporary moment, but within a broader framework as well. We wanted the students really to think about the individual story, the ways in which history is its own form of story, memoir is a way of sharing an individual story, and the implications of what that means within circulation and understanding people's roles within a society as well. So Douglas's narrative is released in 1833. He writes in relation to some of the contestation of his position, either in relation to his slave owner, or in this example, the idea of his slave handler. Okay, so he describes a physical altercation, actually, with Mr. Covey, who's responsible for ensuring that slaves actually comply with the orders that they are given. And he writes, "The battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free." So this notion of the career of the slave is interesting, and I think a very particularly chosen word within that context. It's not a word that circulated frequently within this period of time, not in the ways that it does now, as well as the ways in which Douglass is insisting on this notion of his own humanity within the power negotiations with this individual, Mr. Covey. We also learn a little bit about the ways in which Douglass's position and physically challenging the position of power in Covey really offers a counter-narrative to the dominant historical paradigm at that time. He writes, "It was for a long time a matter of surprise to me why Mr. Covey did not immediately have me taken by the constable to the whipping post, and there regularly whipped for the crime of raising my hand against a white man in defense of myself. And the only explanation I can think of now does not entirely satisfy me, but such as it is, I will give it. Mr. Covey enjoyed the most unbounded reputation for being a first-rate overseer and Negro breaker. It was of considerable importance to him. That reputation was at stake, and had he sent me, a boy about 16 years old, to the public whipping post, his reputation would have been lost. So to save his reputation, he suffered me to go unpunished." So it's really important to remember that Mr. Covey is not a landowner himself. At this period of time in his career as a slave breaker, he didn't hold land and he didn't own slaves. He becomes so successful at this work that later in his life he actually does. But we think Douglass offers us an accessible narrative attending to this notion of agency, right? When we're thinking about these different robotic systems and also a lot of the descriptions associated with artificial intelligence, this notion of agency, the question of decision making, the intentionality of the design seems to be a central focus. And when we're thinking about human-to-human relationships, we have a long history of different populations throughout the world being considered subhuman, inhuman, or this spectrum that basically delineates the power negotiations at play within countries in contest in terms of power, but also access to resources and the drive of capital. So we really wanted the students to be able to think about moments in time where individual humans or whole communities of humans were considered non-human or considered property or considered subhuman, so that they really have a point of comparison in a thoughtful way about the ways in which we might be able to describe as well as interrogate the relationships between these developing machines that are functioning within the social environment. So Douglass also writes, "Silvery-headed age and sprightly youth, maids and matrons had to undergo the same indelicate inspection." This is one of the slave inspections within the context of his circumstances. "At this moment, I saw more clearly than ever the brutalizing effects of slavery upon both slave and slaveholder."
So the point here is that this creates frameworks for interrogating what it means to have societies in which we offer or comport intelligence, agency, intentionality at different and varying degrees to different beings. What's interesting about that slave owner case is Douglass starts to make the case that the very fact that we ascribe agency to a being and then treat it in a certain subaltern way actually dehumanizes us ourselves. And so it really opens up interesting questions about what is it that we ought to be doing in how we treat, design, create, and release robotic systems and AI systems. So, watching that video, the way in which the gentleman is provocative and seems to be harming this machine, which is admittedly just a machine. It has no nerve cells. It can't feel any damage. It can't feel any pain. But it's odd. It does not make people comfortable. And yet we enter a society in which they will have cars on the road that you shouldn't abuse because they're driven by humans, and other cars on the road that you can be somewhat rude to because they're being driven by robots. And it begs this question, will that birefringence change us? Will we be able to switch and mode switch between these different kinds of things? So what we really care about here is, how do we maintain stable categories of what it means to be a citizen or a human? And how do we attend to that in a situation where we may start in a social way to be social, but in non-empathic ways with other kinds of social artificial things around us that help us out? It's not that we're going to confuse the robot with a human being. It's that we're designing explicitly machines that are easy to confuse with human beings in certain ways, purposefully. And it begs the question, how will that change us, if at all? And one set of interesting interrogations around this have to do with language and agency. So let me just introduce a couple of those words to you. Jen mentioned Watson, and that plays really powerfully, because they'd read Douglass. So they'd read this passage in Frederick Douglass. If you teach that Negro how to read, there'd be no keeping him. He'd be forever unfit to be a slave. He'd become unmanageable and of no value. And in fact, Douglass, by writing his narrative, demonstrates the power of literacy, of reading and writing and communication effectiveness. After that, our students actually read some of the press releases about Watson. And in particular, they read some of the writing by doctors, physicians, writing about how, Watson reads so much more than I do. It reads all the medical journals, so it's always smarter than I am about medicine and can make better decisions than me. And these are physicians in interviews with journalists saying the words I just said, saying smarter, better decisions, reads. So we have them look at this stuff. And then we actually give them a little tutorial on exactly how Watson works, how document retrieval systems work, so they understand the statistical nature of it. And when you show somebody that document retrieval system, and then show them how it's writing a sentence back to you, but actually the system has no clue what any of the words in the sentence mean. They are just letters in an alphabet that the system is unfamiliar with. Again, it changes their sense of the power relationship they have to that system, and to the way in which people are putting semantics on top of these systems that really, frankly, don't belong there. So another line from Douglass: you've seen how a man was made a slave, you'll see how a slave was made a man. The interconnection between language and agency, something that's very familiar to anthropologists and rhetoricians and all of you, introducing that to the students, and the notion that language actually provides an avenue for agency to become entrenched, to be identified, and to be blasted out and say, I am an agent and I can make decisions. But at the same time, on the other side, that it imbues in other people an inference that you are an agent, that you can make decisions. So as we create a system like Watson that can read, so to speak, tens of thousands of journal articles a day, then on the other side, the physicians will infer upon it much more intelligence than it has. And that's the danger that we fit into. We wanted the interplay between language and agency to be totally clear. This takes us to a passage from Gerald Siegel that Jen's going to introduce you to in just a couple of slides. But this is where we start to intermingle language and agency. Language gives voice to reflectivity in the grammatical structures of the sentence, which assigns agency to the subject, designating the speaker as active. And that's really interesting, right? Language itself, the spoken word by that robot, makes you believe in the active nature of that robot. And I think that's just critical to the kind of design direction we've been going. Reflective self recognizes itself in this structure when it says, I doubt myself, therefore I exist as a reflective being. So the very ability to be metacognitive suddenly gives you a sense of affordance. And I think it's critical to understand how we're trying to connect the past to the present and the future. We're not trying to equate the past with the future, but we're trying to create structures that let the students actually interrogate the future and think critically.
Yeah, and perhaps just to introduce them to the idea that these questions are not new, just because they're coming in contact with this in the context of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the London Times. A lot of the anxieties and questions that are at play presently certainly are particular to particular systems and their interactions with our current moment in history, but a lot of the questions aren't necessarily new. I shared at the very beginning of the talk that we wanted the students to begin to have multiple tools to understand notions of humanity, ideas circulating around humanity. So we have them read just the introduction of Siegel's The Idea of the Self. And essentially in that piece, Siegel suggests three different categories of individuality: the corporal, the reflexive, and the reflective. And these categories are quite useful for the students to really interrogate and speak back and forth amongst one another about the relationship that they have to the Siegel proposition, the hypothesis, within the context of Western philosophy. But also it allows the students to develop a vocabulary to compare those systems in the human to what they come in contact with, specific optimizations in the systems that they're coming in contact with that we're introducing in the context of the class.
That was a fast switch.
Sorry.
It's quite fine. I forgot. We have to go back and forth.
And we're running out of time.
We've been timing this carefully. Yes, we are running out of time. Actually, we're all right. We can probably talk for 5 more minutes. So, of course, we had to do RUR. And it's not that it's a fantastic play, but it's a way to introduce the students to the idea of a dystopian vision of human versus machine. And it gets right back to exploitation and labor. So what's beautiful about this is before they've read RUR, they've read Mindless. So they've looked at Amazon warehouses and Walmart warehouses and business practices today, before they read this, right? Before they read RUR, they studied the first, second, third, fourth industrial revolutions. And we had an economist come in and tell them about that and about labor and capital flows. Then they go and read something from post-war that actually talks about exactly those issues decades ago. And now they know how to interpret that right. So they have really interesting tools for interpreting that piece of text as a commentary on labor and exploitation. So they read RUR and they get to see that, but they get to see both the commentary on labor and exploitation that RUR represents, and they get to see this kind of arrogance of mimesis, of mimetic technology, the idea of creating something that's a simulacrum of human being. And they get to organize their thoughts around that here, and then yes, later in class, we take them to things like the Geminoids. And so exactly how that's playing out today. So that's another text that we go deep into, and they create a conceptual model for that one as well. We also do that with modern film. This is just a snapshot of a screenshot from Black Mirror. In particular, it's an episode called Be Right Back. It's a really outstanding episode for students to watch, because it's an episode in which a human being dies, and the widow of the human being orders a simulacra of him that's digitally recreated from his digital footprints. And what happens is the film tests the boundary conditions under which this attempted simulation of a human fails, and fails to fulfill emotionally the needs that the woman has, and yet ends up occupying a part of her emotional space that she can't part with. So it becomes this disastrous relationship forever between her and a partial simulation of her husband built on a digital footprint. So it's beautiful because, again, this is something that they get to view, and then they get to study the 2045 project and Boris Itzkoff and Ray Kurzweil. And so now they get to connect dots around imagined science fiction and compare that to what the chief technology officer of Google actually says he intends to do to create his own simulation of his own body. And so they're able to critique that with a language and a grammar that would have been unavailable to them if they hadn't seen that video that demonstrates the kind of dystopian side to the utopian vision that Ray Kurzweil is going to present.
So one of the last examples that we've been attending to within the class is agency and surveillance, and then by virtue of an extension of surveillance, surveillance and autonomous weaponry. So we had students think about the ways in which relatively low-tech construction and configuration of space can achieve the levels of surveillance that might be desired by whatever governing body is in charge. So really thinking about the ways in which oftentimes surveillance is presented as a mode for preserving safety, right, and ensuring that all individuals within a society are kept safe within that context. We also wanted the students to think about the ways in which those built systems begin to compromise our individual agency or collective agency, and how these systems can also begin to control populations at higher levels of scale. The students really start thinking about notions of CCTV cameras, the ways in which that is another form of data input. So really thinking about the scale. We introduced a news article that suggested that Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon is located, will be moving to 300 CCTV cameras in the city by the end of 2018. And then we asked them to think about the notion of 300 CCTV cameras in relation to 470,000 cameras in Beijing, or 420,000 cameras in London, or 17,000 cameras in Chicago. Again, these stats are presented by one of the primary providers of these systems. It's advertised on their website, but we thought it would be worthwhile for the students to really think about the ways in which crude forms of surveillance, like the panopticon, are then either combined or really scaled in pretty astounding ways through the development of CCTV cameras and their blanketing, basically, presence throughout. We also have the students come in contact with other explorations and meditations on the work. So there's a series of paintings by Rita Duffy called Outposts. Rita Duffy is a practitioner in Ireland. She's really an interesting woman who works in multiple medias. She's from Northern Ireland originally, but her studio's in the south, so she literally crosses the border each day, moving from her home to her studio, and that is a very deliberate choice on her part. She was able to gain permission from the Provisional IRA to actually, and the British military, to go into the militarized outposts that dotted the border of Northern Ireland before the complete demilitarization of that border in 2004, I think was when she went. Anyone who's following the Brexit conversations understands that that border is in contestation yet again. But we see here in her meditation on the work the very rudimentary notion of the outpost within the context of Ireland, as well as a highly sophisticated military outpost associated with her particular moment at the turn of the 21st century. We also have the students read excerpts of drone theory so that they can really start thinking critically about the ways in which autonomy is a contested term within state-of-the-art conversations, but also think quite deliberately on the implications of these weapon systems, particularly in the United States' role internationally. We just had these conversations with students. We invited Lucy Suckman to chat with the students via Skype. We have another philosopher, David Danks, on our campus who does a lot of work on questions of trusts and ethical systems that inform autonomous weaponry. It became pretty clear before we left on an airplane to come here on Tuesday that the students had not really thought about these questions, even though they come in contact with newspaper articles pertaining to drone warfare in everyday life. They had not really considered the implications for this until that class. We had a lot of downcast faces by the end of that class, to put it lightly.
I think we might want to skip to the...
Yep, we're pretty much done. So essentially, what we've been doing with this experiment is really trying to introduce students to thinking quite critically about the roles that they will play as the next generation of technologists, as well as the humanists and social scientists who will be attending to the implications of the technologists' developments. Overall, learning objectives really were to focus on identifying, describing, and responding historical examples of representation of power between individuals. You can see we're interested in the students developing language to describe and evaluate the contemporary and historical taxonomies of humans and machines and their relationships to one another. Really exploring a variety of narrative forms that explore these relationships, to map out the foundational technological innovations that have resulted and might lead to disruptive advancements of AI, contributions to the discourse regarding AI that synthesize the marriage of historical and future-facing articulation, and having the students create either individual or group future-looking mixed media projects that are then paired with the conceptual maps that they develop for the end of term. So as we presented at the very beginning, this was a sequencing of the course this semester to really have the students work slowly over time to attend to these themes.
So we loved coming to wording precisely because it was a map of words that we believed created just the right framework for taking something this interdisciplinary and having the students be able to make sense of it. And I think we have a few minutes left, so we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions and comments about this.
Illah and Jennifer, a very nice course you have here. Let me strongly encourage you to put it as a MOOC. I would advertise it for our students. It should really be attended by a lot of people to step back and try to understand the kind of concepts that we take for granted and that we need to think about. It's really a very nice course that you have. Now, my question is regarding this issue of the dynamics of the meanings that we associate to concepts and to words and so on. Of course, the drivers for these dynamics are very complex. So in what you studied or what you are teaching, what is the specific role of the scientists in that? Is it very tiny, narrow, and do they play a more significant role? Do we have a hope of pushing these dynamics in a good way, in the way we think good?
Can we both take a stab at that?
Sure.
So first of all, thank you for the kind words about the course. We are in fact, instead of making the course with a bunch of PowerPoint presentations, we've done technology notes and reflections in written form, so we can put it all into a book. So our hope is to be able to get this out as quickly as possible, and we're working with the publisher on that. What I was going to say about the role of the technologist is I think that there's a line from a cultural study, Boundaries of Science book Thomas Guerin wrote, where he says that technologists constantly underestimate the downstream influence of their technology and the language around the technology. I think we need to train technologists. I think the scientists have thoroughly failed us in not misunderstanding how literally journalists and citizens take the words they choose to use. Autonomy is this disastrous term. And when we talk about autonomy of drones, of military robots, you can give examples that people call autonomous on a complete spectrum, from remote control to you just build it and then somehow it leaves the factory and is a killer bee and it goes and does things. And nobody has any way to isolate autonomy as one particular point on the spectrum that Sheridan might draw you. So it's a disaster. And I think what we need to do is actually to train our scientists to become socially aware.
Or to introduce the students as developing scientists to the idea that there are fields that attend to this, right? So linguists attend to this. People in my camp in literature and cultural studies do. But one of the things that I will say in relation to your question also is my primary role at Carnegie Mellon is actually in curriculum development. So we have developed this course within a whole series of courses that I'm working with other faculty in developing for first-year students. They're called Grand Challenge Seminars, and we're just in the first year of that pilot. But we had another course this fall that brought together students from the School of Engineering and the Humanities and Social Science School to attend to the question of climate change. We also have more firmly in the Humanities and Social Sciences this spring semester a class on gendered violence, another class on racism, and another class on inequality. So a lot of the hat that I wear is really thinking about the ways in which we can develop curriculum that brings the science students in the same classroom as the humanists and social scientists so that they understand that these fields exist, and ideally to develop some type of cross-disciplinary discourse through the course of their undergraduate studies.
Okay. Another question, comment? No? No more, but we are perfectly on time. Then thank you again.